Chapter 710 Unfolding of Events. Thump. Done. I patted my hands while a body fell flat on the ground in front of me. Taking out one of the tubes Melissa had given me moments prior, I opened the Duke's mouth and poured the contents into his throat. Uka. His body jerked immediately after pouring the substance into his mouth, seemingly rejecting its existence. But I didn't care and forced the contents in. His complexion gradually began to fade away, becoming paler by the second, while at the same time, scales began to form on his skin and black veins began to emerge. It looks like it's working. The poison did indeed look rather effective. My body is a lot sorer than I thought. Stretching my back, I felt every part of me ache. I guess this is a consequence of ingesting the Duchess's blood. It was only after I swallowed a bit of her blood that I was able to acquire a sloth-related ability. Because I didn't take much of it, it wasn't very strong, rather it was pretty weak, but it was still there. Furthermore, it was only because I had the nectar that I even dared to swallow her blood. Had it not been for that, I probably would have never done such a daring thing. It was worth it though. I refrained from giving the demon a further glance and instead turned to look to my right, where I saw a lovely figure standing with her bow held low in her left hand. I thanked her. Thanks. Amichum. Amanda did nothing more than give a slight nod of her head before walking forward and retrieving the arrow that had pierced the core of the guard. Putting her arrow away, she looked at me. Do you think the demons will be aware that something happened now that he's dead? Don't worry about it. I reassured her and looked at the Duke beside me. Unlike the Duke over here, the guard doesn't have any contractees. His death will not cause any commotion. According to what the Duchess told me, it was forbidden for the guards to enter into contracts with other beings. I didn't have a crystal clear understanding of the reasoning behind this action, but I knew the Duchess wouldn't intentionally mislead me about something of this nature. Thus I just went ahead and killed them. It saved me from using all of the gallbladder. Lifting my head to stare at the moon hanging in the sky, I turned around. Let's go. We still got a lot of work to do. We only have tonight to act. Duchess K-Love, Duke Reincarnated, Duke Given and Duke Ensandrix. These were the names of the 4 remaining successors. All of them were at the beginner Duke realm and were rather respected. Before I left the mansion, the Duchess presented me with a comprehensive booklet that contained all of the information she possessed regarding them. Their habits, the environment in which they live, the people with whom they associated with, and much more. They seemed like a lively bunch. Unfortunately, on this very bright, the 4 of them took their last breath. That makes it the last of them. Thump. A demon fell before my feet and I wiped the sweat that had accumulated on my forehead. I had to struggle through it, but after a few hours of hard work I was able to get everything that needed to be done. Thankfully, the night here lasts almost 3 times more than Earth, else I wouldn't have been able to finish by dawn. Shifting my gaze toward the horizon, a bright yellow glow began to tint the sky, and what appeared to be an orange sphere began to rise into the air. The operation lasted approximately 1.5 days, all of which took place during the same night cycle. Such unusually long nights initially struck me as odd, but I very quickly adjusted to the new schedule. I was used to not sleeping. Are you also done? I looked at Amanda. Staring back at me, she nodded her head. Yes. That's great. That's great. I stretched my back and yawned. Let's go back then. I need to catch up on some good sleep. I was worn out, and after everything was said and done, all of the preparations were finished. All I needed to do was wait. Wait for everything to piece itself together. By the time I wake up, I'll know if the plan worked or not. At the very moment that I was about to leave, I felt a warm and gentle grasp on my hand. After looking down, I could see a soft hand grasping mine. Raising my head a little, I found Amanda quietly staring toward the distance without making a single sound. I smiled at her actions. Let's go. I guess she could still be cute while under the influence of demonic energy. Ambush at point Z has failed. The enemy seemed prepared. Requesting backup. Ambush at point X has failed. The enemy seemed prepared. Requesting backup. Ambush at point U has failed. The enemy seemed prepared. Requesting backup. Hemlock's device was inundated with a tidal wave of notifications, all of which came in the form of an alarm signal. The continuous notifications were the only sound that rang within the confines of the now empty hall. Staring at the message, cracks formed on Hemlock's calm face. What's going on? It came as a bit of a surprise to him that the Alliance had discovered the trap that they had laid. It was something that they had meticulously prepared in order to take advantage of the ability that one of 870X's companions had. The one to control animals. That wasn't what surprised him the most, though. He was taken aback by the fact that they were aware in some way that they had elder-ranked individuals hiding close to the mana compressors. Such information wasn't something they should have been aware of. A traitor. It was the only explanation he could think of. Other than someone betraying him, how could such information be leaked? This makes things rather problematic. Hemlock found the situation rather annoying. He had set up a lot of plans and he had even sacrificed several high-ranking members in order to achieve his goals. And yet someone chose to betray him? Just who could it be? It's definitely not the other high members, since I'd no thanks to the chip in their head. Every single action and motion that they took was tracked by the chip. Be it when they ate, slept, or went to the bathroom. The chip knew it all. In addition, they each had a specific team that was constantly monitoring everything that they were seeing and hearing. Furthermore, he had made it so that if he died, all the chips would simultaneously explode. It'd be stupid of them to try anything against him. It was also because of this that Hemlock was reasonably confident that it wasn't them. Just who? Don't dwell on it for too long. A crisp voice sounded within the empty space of the hall, startling Hemlock. When he raised his head to stare in the direction of where the voice came from, he was surprised to see two crimson-red eyes staring back at him. His figure was cloaked by the darkness of the hall, but Hemlock recognized him immediately. "It's you." Surprised. But. The rhythmic echo of his steps reverberated throughout the empty hall, and shortly thereafter, Kevin made his way beneath the seat that Hemlock was occupying. For a moment, neither of them spoke, allowing the silence to permeate the entire room. The two were carefully studying one another. The silence didn't last for long, however. Soon Kevin broke it. "You're rather ruthless, aren't you? Killing your own high-ranking members in order to conquer the great cities fast." "I did what needed to be done," Hemlock replied, his gaze never leaving Kevin's. "It worked, didn't it?" "It sure did." Kevin took a few moments to survey his surroundings before settling down in one of the hall's empty seats. He made himself comfortable. "It caught me off guard a little bit. I didn't expect you to use such a method. It was rather refreshing." "How did you get here?" Hemlock questioned in an icy tone. How was it that he was able to approach the monolith without attracting anyone's attention along the way? Additionally, in order to prevent the others from discovering the location of the headquarters, they moved it without anyone else's knowledge. It was no longer in the same place it was in the past, and only he and a few others knew the exact location of the monolith. Was it the spy again? "There's no spy." His thoughts were broken by Kevin's words. Looking up at him, Hemlock frowned. "Then how did you get here? Even if you were an SSS-ranked, you'd still be noticed by the system in place." A special dome surrounded the headquarters. It would detect any movement and wasn't something that anyone below SSS-rank, let alone lower, could bypass. It was a technology directly given to him by the demons. "Did you find a flaw with the system, or did someone let you in?" "Neither," he answered, prompting Hemlock's frown to deepen. "Then what gave you the confidence to come here with your meager strength?" "Meager?" Kevin looked at him oddly. Pressing his hands against the armrest and slowly lifting himself up, he took a deep breath. Turbid air slowly diffused into the air. He extended his hand and a sword materialized in it. At the same time, the world around Hemlock began to gradually lose both color and sound. After that, a suffocating pressure permeated the entirety of the hall, and cracks started to surface on the pillars that were supporting it. Hemlock's pupils drew wider as he sensed the power leaving Kevin, and he followed Kevin's lead by standing up. How is this possible? The power he was feeling. "Stop overthinking." Deeply staring at him, Kevin's mouth parted open. "I'm at a realm that the likes of you will never be able to achieve in one lifetime." He slashed his sword and the space collapsed. Chapter 7:11 Unfolding of Events. Boom. Large portions of the hall collapsed inwardly, crashing against the ground beneath them as the sound of a significant explosion reverberated through the air. Boom. Boom. The hall continued to shake and dust continued to fly into the air, creating a veil that obscured what was taking place behind it. In the midst of the veil, bright white lights flashed while muffled explosions accompanied them. Each impact was felt throughout the entire headquarters as buildings collapsed and the dome protecting the facility continuously flickered. Cracks soon started to form and alarms started to ring. This didn't last for long, however. Silence soon returned to the headquarters in the aftermath of the short conflict. A great number of figures were seen lying on the ground as they took their final breaths, and those that were still alive did not even dare to move an inch. They were helpless in the face of the overwhelming power that radiated from the hull, and they dared not even consider the events that had transpired there. Whatever had taken place was beyond their comprehension. Within the destroyed hull. How is this possible? Hemlock had a difficult time catching his breath. He looked up at two crimson-red eyes that shone menacingly against the dark backdrop of the hull as a hand clenched tightly around his throat. How are you this strong? It made no sense. It was impossible. This can't be real. How is this possible? He who had just broken through SSS- rank was supposed to be the strongest human in existence. Apart from Octavius, there shouldn't be anyone else that could pose a threat against him, so how is this possible? It makes no sense. Of course it doesn't. The mute sound of Kevin's voice gradually made its way to him. Shivers ran down Hemlock's spine as he noticed his calm gaze pause on him. He continued. The sacrifice and pain I underwent to get to where I am isn't something that the likes of you can ever hope to understand. His power wasn't something he had acquired over the course of a couple of decades. Far from it. It was a skill he had acquired through a million distinct regressions. Throughout the centuries he died over and over again. Endlessly. To the point where death was merely a number to him. All of it was for this one moment. Be glad you got to live as long as you did. If not because I allowed it, you wouldn't have lived as long as you did. Had he not recovered his memories and power this late, he would have long since killed him. What he was doing now was something he should have done a while back but didn't. It was the last thing that he needed to do. Kevin tightened his grip on his neck, staring deeply into Hemlock's eyes, which shook with what appeared to be fear. He still seemed to be able to get a few words out. Why are you doing this? He wasn't asking why he was trying to kill him. He already understood why. What he wanted to comprehend was the reason why Kevin would attempt to conceal their strength and only act now. What benefit would such action bring him? Don't worry about such a trivial matter. Kevin replied in a soft manner, further tightening his grip on his neck. Once again staring deeply into his eyes, his gaze softened for a moment. Your approach wasn't crazy. Had it been another time, maybe you would have been able to accomplish what you set out to do. Perhaps humanity wouldn't really go into extinction like you wanted, but... Crack. Hemlock's body limped over Kevin's hand as the sound of bones breaking reverberated throughout the space. It directly conflicts against my interests, and for that you have to die. Just like that, the leader of the monolith and an SSS-ranked entity died. Thump. Kevin threw his body to the side, and as he did so, his limp trembled, and he quickly brought his hand up to cover his mouth. Piff. Immediately, blood began to spurt over his hand as his face began to turn pale, and he fell to the ground on both knees. Boo. Thump. Boo. Thump. Boo. Thump. As he struggled to breathe and move, he was almost able to feel his heart thumping against the back of his throat. He felt a sense of powerlessness wash over his body, and he fell to the ground while in excruciating pain. He moaned out in agony, unable to overcome the pain that he was experiencing. Every single second seemed like an eternity to him, and the pain in his chest increased with every breath he took. It felt as though he was being burned alive. Clutching his shirt tightly, he rolled around and supported his body up. Piff. Even more blood came up in his vomit, and his arm was nearly rendered completely limp. It took everything that he had in him to prevent himself from passing out at that precise moment. He couldn't allow himself to pass out. Not yet. I don't have much time left. Human domain. The ominous clattering of metal could be heard all along the derelict streets and buildings that were falling apart. Clank. There was a fierce battle going on between the members of the Alliance and the members of the Monolith. There was blood everywhere on the ground, and significant casualties were sustained by both sides. The ground was covered in severed limbs and blood, and one could faintly hear the screams of desperation coming from those who had managed to survive. Elsewhere, up above in the sky, Boom. Just die already, you old witch number 2. A high-pitched voice echoed through the air. It belonged to a girl with orange hair who was covered in orange armor. The armor complemented her body perfectly and covered all areas of her body, not leaving a single spot exposed. She glared at the elderly woman who was standing in the opposite direction from her, and as she did so, a soft hue floated out of the corner of her eyes. Why oh you? The elderly woman shot Monica an angry look. Her white hair was all over her face and her clothes were in pretty bad shape. How did you know? She wasn't supposed to be here. This was meant to be a trap set up for them in order to eliminate their forces. How was it possible for someone of Monica's stature to show up? She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be guarding Ashton City. It didn't make sense. Why would they take such a risk? Did he betray us? A faint memory of what happened a little while back resurfaced in her mind. The woman's body came to a halt in midair after she had an abrupt realization about something. It was the only explanation she could come up with at the moment, and her eyes grew startlingly large as she uttered it. Don't tell me. Beep. 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 The woman's expression morphed dramatically as an alarming beeping sound suddenly reverberated throughout the space. Damn it. Damn it. No oh. She barely had time to finish what she was saying before her body began to rapidly expand, and, boom. The sky was suddenly illuminated by a blinding light, which was accompanied by a deafening boom that seemed to travel in waves and shook the entire landscape. The force of the explosion was so strong that it lifted the ground from underneath it, resulting in a mushroom cloud of ash, rubble and smoke filling the sky, which in turn made the day appear darker. Wind and heat rushed outward from the explosion site, igniting everything in its path and destroying it. A desolate landscape was left behind after the explosion as a result of the shockwave that traveled for miles after that. The explosion was followed by an eerie silence, followed by what was comparable to the cracking sound of a shell. Crack crack. With her forward hand, the shield that surrounded Monica shattered into pieces, scattering in the air into millions of particles. Itchy. Her complexion was extremely pale, and her orange hair was in a tangled mess all over her head. The once orange armor that she had been wearing was now riddled with cracks, and her body swayed as it swayed through the air. His is much more than I expected. Never in her life did she believe that the blast would be this powerful. She lucked out in that she had been given prior warning and was consequently somewhat ready. Regardless, she had a much more limited understanding of the situation than she had originally thought. Cough. She coughed several times before looking down. Her eyes soon calmed down. Crack. A cracking sound reverberated from below, and the energy shield that had been protecting a group of people broke apart at the same time as she looked over. Monica gently landed beside them and moved to the somewhat pale Donna. I'm glad you guys are all right. Why yeah. Donna gave a small nod, and her gaze shifted toward the town that had been completely leveled. Lowering her head to look at the device in her hand, she felt secretly relieved. Never before had she felt death so close. I'm glad we came prepared. Tell me about it. Amber stammered her way over to join in on the conversation. Her complexion was almost as white as paper and her hair was a complete mess. You think the other squads are also safe? I don't know. Monica shook her head. She raised her wrist and looked at her watch. You've seen just how powerful the explosion was. Had we not been ready? She didn't finish her sentence, but both Donna and Amber understood the meaning of her words. They came really close to death. Ding. Exactly at that moment, a clear sound came out of nowhere and everyone's attention immediately went to the watch. It's from Kev. No, I mean the Alliance leader. Looks like an image. Monica corrected herself and swiped up. As soon as the image appeared, everyone stopped moving and stared at it in silence. The atmosphere froze completely. Is this a joke? Monica stuttered as she looked at the picture in front of her, appearing to be in a state of complete disbelief. It wasn't just her. Donna and Amber also struggled to keep their composure as their eyes shook in disbelief. How? This isn't possible. Contained within the image was a familiar figure laying on the ground, lifeless. A single message could be found underneath it. However, at the very moment that they read the message, their hearts stopped. Done. Chapter 7:12 Unfolding of Events. 3. What's going on in here? When I got back from my trip, I was greeted by a thick cloud of smoke. Did the mansion catch fire? But how was that possible? Looking at Amanda, both of us made a dash for the main hall in an attempt to locate the source of the smoke. Arriving at the large wooden door, I smacked it open. Clank. What's going on in H? In the middle of my sentence, I had to pause in order to rub both of my eyes. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't interpreting what I was seeing incorrectly. I'm not high, am I? I'm almost out, human. Give me another pack. I've already given you 2. What about it? Can't you see that I'm already almost done? Smoking harms. Bang. Damn it, human. Don't fucking test me. Test you for what? You haven't even paid me anything for the packs. Ah, so it was about the money. Why didn't you say so? I'll reward you handsomely for another pack, so hurry up and give it to me. No. I only have 1 left, and that's for me. Damn you, human. Bang. The table fell apart, and the Duchess got to her feet immediately. The anger visible on her face was accompanied by a heaving motion in her chest. In her mouth was a half-lit cigarette. Didn't you just say that you'd sell it to me? You a swindler. When did I say I was ever going to sell it to you? I just pointed out the fact that you took 2 packs from me for free. Bastard. She cursed again. Do you have any idea as to who I am? I don't care. I'll fight you. What in the world happened during the time Amanda and I were out? I pinched the middle of my brows. The room was a complete disaster, and the scattered pieces of what appeared to be chairs, in conjunction with the conversation that I had overheard, helped me get an understanding of what was happening. It's just that I found it hard to believe. I can't believe this is what I returned to. Before stepping in between the 2 of them, I let out an internal sigh. Despite how entertaining it was, I had no choice but to put an end to this. There were more important things at hand. Bastard, are you going to sell it to me or not? No. You fuck. Let's stop this for a moment. Maybe I shouldn't have interfered. After being suddenly glared at by the 2 of them, I was at a loss of what to make out of the situation. It was, if anything, a fairly burdensome situation. I still raised my hands and tried to calm them down. Relax for now. I more or else understand the problem. When I have time, I'll get you as many packs as you want. Thankfully, it appeared that the solution was fairly straightforward. Everything would get back to normal as long as the Duchess was pleased with the outcome. Really? The Duchess's eyes lit up and she became noticeably less angry as a result. As soon as I saw this, I let out a sigh of relief and glanced over at Jean for a split second. Since when did he start smoking? It caught me off guard, but I quickly shoved the thought to the back of my mind and focused my attention back on the Duchess. Cigarettes aside. I've already completed what I set out to do. Huh. When the Duchess heard what I had to say, her expression changed to one of surprise. You finished already? This quick? Yeah, I've already completed everything on my end. The Duchess looked at me with a suspicious expression on her face. She then took the finished cigarette out of her mouth and flicked it in Jin's direction before replacing it. This caused him to narrow his eyes at her, but if anything, this was the response that she had hoped for. Thus her expression changed to a happy one. Clearing her throat, she looked back at me. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I don't believe you. It's just that I still didn't receive any news from my side, so I find it rather hard to believe you. That's understandable. I smiled, but I didn't go into further detail. Whether or not I took the time to explain it to her, she would eventually figure it out on her own, regardless. Alright then. On to the next step. I happily clapped my hands and stared at the Duchess. When I extended my hand in her direction, she immediately retreated 1 step. What are you doing? Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt you, we've already signed a contract. My words didn't seem to hold any effect on the Duchess as she still stepped back. Even so, what are you doing? Why do you want to suddenly touch me? You'll soon find out. Don't worry about it. SOHH. Channeling my demonic energy and mana, the Duchess froze on the spot, and my hand soon came into contact with her head. After a moment, a bright white glow appeared on my fingertips, and I activated memory manipulation. My vision suddenly became hazy, and what appeared to be millions upon millions of spheres of varying hues filled the space in front of my eyes. I glanced through them very quickly before reaching out with my hand and having several of them fly in the direction in which I was standing. This is it. After seizing one of the orbs and inspecting the contents contained within, I channeled my mana, causing a layer of dark threads to begin covering the orb, which I then tossed to the side. Next. Over the next few minutes, I looked around for any orbs that might have contained recollections of the others and myself, and I covered them before discarding them. When I was finished, there were 100 pitch-black spheres floating around me. I had long since lost track of time and was thus unaware of how long I had been doing this. I had to erase any memory she had of the others and myself completely from her mind. It was something that needed to be done in order to make sure that everything worked perfectly, and it was imperative that it be done. I needed a genuine reaction. This should be all. When I waved my hand, the spheres moved away from each other and dispersed. With another wave of my hand, my vision shifted and I suddenly found myself back in the hall. Thump. Priscilla's body fell next to me. Jean was able to grab hold of her just in time and place her safely on the ground. After gazing at her for a brief moment, he turned his attention back to me. "What did you do?" I looked at him strangely. "You worried about her?" "No." "Then, just answer." I sighed and waved my hand. "Don't worry about it. I just made her forget about us for now. I'll return her memories later." "I see." Jean nodded, then picked up the blunt that had been left on the ground. He flicked his hand and it vanished into thin air. "I assume you also want to erase all evidence of us ever coming into contact with her, right?" I smiled at Jean. "You sure pick things up fast." As I looked around, I pointed out all of the blunts that had been thrown around. There were quite a lot of them. "Just how much did the two smoke?" "Get rid of all of them." "What about the mess?" He pointed at the broken chairs and tables. "Good question." After pondering for a moment, I eventually waved my hand. "Leave it be. When she wakes up, she'll come to think that she did it out of rage over what happened today with Duke Yukin." Normally, I would have thought that this was a poor attempt at an explanation, but after catching a glimpse of the real her, I had a sneaking suspicion that she was indeed the type of demon to do this. Jean seemed to think the same as he nodded his head in understanding. "Ah, fair. It indeed seems plausible." He soon found himself chuckling while looking around him. The corner of my lips twisted upwards. It was rare to see Jean act like this. He usually tended to be extremely serious. "You seem to get along with her quite well." "You think?" Moving one of the tables, Jean picked up a blunt and showed it to me. "She gets along with this more than me." "Right." My brows furrowed the moment I looked at the blunt. "You know, it's best if you stop smoking." "Why? It's not like it can kill me." "Right. Indeed, in this day and age, smoking does not kill." The problem was that about half of my memories were completely fabricated, and despite my best efforts, I was unable to fully differentiate between those memories and the real world. Thus, I felt a natural sense of rejection toward smoking. It was just nasty. "Do whatever. Just don't smoke next to me." I relented in the end. It was ultimately his decision to smoke, and I had no real influence over his behavior in that regard. I should start dealing with the rest. I stared out the window, toward the sun, which didn't seem to have moved more than an inch since I had last seen it. Turning around, I headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Jin's voice echoed from behind. I answered without looking back at him. "She's not the only person that knows about our existence." Aside from her, there were a number of other demons who were aware of our existence, which was something that I couldn't allow for this to work. I had to remove their memories as well. I was thankfully already prepared. According to the Duchess, there aren't many who know of my existence. Just 5, so just a couple of hours worth of work. In accordance with one of the terms of the agreement, she was required to disclose to me the names of everyone who was aware of my existence. It was a clause I had placed in the contract just for this. From the moment the contract is signed, both parties will disclose how many entities are aware of the existence of the contract and the other party. It's nice to be prepared. I smiled in satisfaction while lazily stretching my shoulder. Clank. I opened the door and left the hall. Just a bit more. A bit more before I could finally rest. Chapter 713 Unfolding of Events. 4. The next day. As soon as Priscilla opened her eyes, she was hit with a severe headache. It was excruciatingly painful, and for a good minute she was forced to do nothing more than lean against her couch. What happened over here? While she was massaging her forehead, she noticed that her room was in utter disarray, with every piece of furniture in shattered pieces. Ugh. She blinked several times trying to recall all the information. Ah, right, it's about that fucker. Faint memories started to enter her mind, and she soon came to the conclusion that this came as a result of her rage toward Duke Yukin. Her memory was still hazy, but the more she thought about it, the more convinced she was. It wasn't the first time that something like this had happened. Bastard. She muttered an expletive as she recalled what had transpired in the cave the day prior. It was difficult to put into words exactly how irritated she was at this very moment. I should have someone clean up this mess. Throwing one last glance at her surroundings, Priscilla gradually stood up. She ruffled her hair and started walking toward the door, but just as she took the first step toward it, the door suddenly burst open and one of her servants walked in. Duchess. His tone of voice carried an air of panic, which caused her pretty features to contort into a frown. What is it? It's. The servant took a deep breath just as a look that could be interpreted as fear crossed his eyes. The manner in which he carried himself piqued Priscilla's interest even further. That. The servant stumbled over his words as if he was having trouble articulating a sentence. His actions annoyed Priscilla. She glared at him. What is it? Spit it out before I get annoyed. She had no idea what was causing it, but for some unexplainable reason she found herself becoming irritated by everything at the moment. Be it her servant, the smell that lingered in the air, and the sunlight filtering through the windows. Even when facing the servant, whom she usually treated with courtesy, she found herself unable to hide her true self. The words coming out of her mouth were rather crude. What's going on with me this morning? She smacked her lips. It felt as though she was missing something. It's. The servant kept stuttering, but it wasn't long before he gathered his composure and was finally able to utter a few words. The patriarch is present and would like to speak with you. The words of the servant echoed in her mind like a clap of thunder. Her mind went completely blank. Ah. It was at this point that Priscilla finally understood why the servant was behaving the way that he was. To talk. Priscilla rapped on the heavy wooden door in a submissive manner. As she dipped her head, she dared not look directly out the door. The door induced in her an unexplainable feeling of suffocation. She waited for what seemed to be hours until a voice finally sounded from the other side. Come in. Something eerie and powerful was housed within the speaker's voice, making her blood boil as a result. It was so suffocating that she felt paralyzed and unable to move until a few seconds after the voice had ceased to be heard. If you'll excuse me. She did not linger and immediately opened the door. Almost immediately after that, she was presented with the sight of a sizable office area. The entire room was illuminated by two large windows and a large chandelier that hung above the ceiling. But the person seated in the middle of the room was the thing that drew her attention. A demon with long pinkish straight hair, red eyes that glowed brightly, a black suit and extremely handsome features. He sat behind the desk in a relaxed manner, quietly writing over a couple of papers. Priscilla's anxiety was only exacerbated by the unnatural serenity that he exuded, which, despite giving the impression that he was not dangerous, only served to heighten her concern about him. She bowed her head and greeted. Greetings, grandfather. You're here. The strange feeling of oppression that had lingered in his words faded away, and in its place was a voice that was calm and clear. He stared directly at Priscilla, his gaze hazy. Something big has happened. Yes. Priscilla was taken aback by his words, and she immediately pulled herself together and stood up straight. She immediately thought of a possibility. Has the meeting with the World Decree gone badly? With the World Decree soon coming up, her grandfather, the patriarch, had set out to meet the other patriarchs in order to discuss the terms of the event. It had been about a month since she'd last seen him. Had something gone wrong with the meeting? Were the other houses planning on joining together against them, or was the House of Envy up to something again? It's not what you're thinking. The patriarch swiftly put an end to her train of thought. When she looked up, she was taken aback to see a rare frown appear on his face. Something that she'd only witnessed a couple of times in her life. At that very moment, she had the sudden realization that the situation was a great deal more serious than she had anticipated. If grandfather shows such face, I'm afraid that things are a lot worse than I expected. Her heart dropped at the thought and she kept her mouth shut, waiting for her grandfather's instructions. This didn't take long as he soon spoke. The contents of his words stunned her completely. Something very big happened last night, on a scale large enough to alarm all of the patriarchs. Priscilla experienced a brief pause in her breathing. She was just starting to get a grasp on how dire the situation really was. While she was already somewhat prepared, things were far more serious than she had originally anticipated, and she already thought things were serious. But for some reason, Priscilla felt something was amiss with the current situation. Why is grandfather looking at me like that? His gaze was odd in a number of ways. She was at a loss for words, but she tried her best to keep her composure. Whatever it was, she would just follow his instructions. His next words shed some light on the situation. I had originally come here expecting the worst. However, seeing that you're still safe here, it seems like we've fallen for a scheme. A scheme. Emichung. With a nod of his head, the patriarch stood up from his seat and waved his hand. There's no time to explain. You'll get a better understanding of the situation soon. After hearing his words, Priscilla's surroundings began to change and become more drawn out. Everything around her started to stretch and distort. It was an odd sight, and she sensed that something powerful was pulling her body in a certain direction. It wasn't long before everything began to take an unexpected twist, and before she knew it, the landscape had shifted. She was now standing inside a magnificent, enormous, and awe-inspiring room. Why are we here? She had been there a few times before, and she found that she instantly recognized the location upon arrival. Reincarnated Hall. The holiest site on the entire planet and the location of the most important gatherings presided over by the patriarchs of the 7 houses. After entering the hall, she cast her gaze in every direction. 2 magnificent marble columns that reached almost all the way to the ceiling stood to her left and right, respectively. The passageways, which were adorned with sumptuous velvet curtains and ornate gilded mirrors, extended off into the distance in either direction, while the center of the room was a swirl of activity. A grand chandelier hung suspended from the center of the ceiling, throwing a brilliant cascade of sparkles from hundreds of suspended crystals across the entire space. A grand staircase swept down from the balcony above, leading to a stage that was set up at the edge of the room. Had it not been for the sudden appearance of several people at the moment, she would have taken more time to admire the place. Swoosh. Swoosh. Priscilla found herself choking back a mouthful of saliva as the once vacant hall quickly began to fill up with people. She lowered quietly, unable to muster the courage to look upward, feeling the pressure from those who emerged. She recognized the demons that had just arrived. How could she not? As soon as she saw them, she was overcome with a feeling that was similar to the one she had experienced when she was with her grandfather. It was suffocating. Is everyone over here? Soon after, she heard a solemn voice reach her ear. The voice was rather soft, but the moment it was heard, the whole hall trembled. She shivered even more fiercely, especially when she felt the gaze linger on her body for a few seconds. For a brief moment, she felt her life flash before her eyes. To her great relief, her grandfather took immediate action and put an end to whatever was going on. Mind your manners. That does not appear to be a friendly way to greet a successor. Humph. The demon withdrew his gaze briefly before turning and proceeding further into the hall. His next words were rather ambiguous, but they contained a certain hint of a threat that left Priscilla wondering just what in the world had happened. We've got a lot to discuss. I hope I get a clear explanation for what has happened. Chapter 714 Culprit. Approximately 50 feet beneath the Grand Hall was a separate space. Typically, discussions between the parties would be held above the surface, in the main hall. Only rarely would the lower level ever be used. And when this occurred, it almost always indicated that something of an extremely grave nature had taken place. The atmosphere of the bunker was cold and tense. 10 people surrounded a large oval-shaped table that was lit by a single spotlight that shone down on the table's center point. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Everyone's attention was directed toward a demon who was dressed in a long black robe and a hood and stood at the opposite end of the table. He was Prince David, the current patriarch of the House of Envy. He silently surveyed the room with a look of contempt, as the others looked back at him expressionlessly. Behind Prince David was another demon, similarly adorning a black hood to cover its features. The demon seemed somewhat out of it as they held onto the chair to support themselves. In spite of that, their gaze was currently focused on Priscilla, who was standing behind her grandfather. Their gaze wasn't a friendly one. Prince Devitt spoke again. Judging from how there's only 10 of us, the situation is a lot more serious than anticipated. His voice resounded throughout the room as soft, repeated whispers that uncomfortably tickled the ears of those present. It caused Priscilla a great of discomfort, but all she could do was remain standing in silence. More serious than anticipated? One of the seated demons spoke, his voice bordering on amusement. Similarly, there was another figure standing behind him, but compared to the one standing behind Prince Devitt, he wasn't wearing a hood and everyone was able to see the state he was in. It wasn't good. His skin was as white as paper and he could hardly keep his eyes open. He appeared to be in a lot of pain. It was likely that he would have collapsed to the ground had it not been for the thin white film that was covering his body. It also seemed like he was being forced to stay awake. Another demon glared at the demon that spoke. Is there something funny about the situation, Prince Arian? I do. Prince Sorling. Prince Arian covered his mouth to hide his smile while addressing Prince Sorling. You may not find it amusing, but it's nothing short of amusing to me. Unable to hold it in anymore, he started cackling out loud. Kikik, I never would have expected to. See a day where you all look so troubled. Such amusement. His laughter lasted for a couple of minutes, during which time none of the demons displayed any reaction to the behavior he was displaying. It was as if they were already used to it. Are you done laughing? Eventually, another demon spoke. He was a burly-looking demon with muscles the size of melons. Briefly glancing at Prince Arian, he looked toward Prince Valing of the House of Sloth and paused his gaze on Priscilla. His eyes immediately narrowed. Catching his gaze, Prince Valing called out. Is something the matter, Prince Atten? You seem to be looking at my successor an awful lot. She's pretty, right? A smile lingered on Prince Valing's face as he addressed Prince Atten. He didn't seem too bothered by the fact that everyone was now looking in his direction. Or to be more precise, Priscilla. He maintained the same cool demeanor he had been displaying up until this point as he looked around at the others and mocked. Is something the matter? Have you all been charmed by her beauty? Charm. A voice that was both mellow and crystalline floated through the air. Instantaneously, the two demons who were standing behind Prince Devitt and Prince Arian fell into a daze. Both of them were instantly brought back to themselves by a wave of Prince Devitt's hand, and he then turned to address the person who was responsible for the little stunt. This isn't the time for your little jokes, Princess Ran. With long black hair and a face that could not be described as anything but the word beautiful, Princess Ran, the head of the charm house, covered her mouth and laughed. Her laughter was like the sound of pearls being clinked together. It was crisp and pleasant to the ears. I was just trying to respond to the comment made by Prince Valing. While the young lady is indeed beautiful, she still has a long way to go before reaching the point where she can charm everyone in the room. Removing her hand from her mouth, the smile on her face disappeared and her eyes squinted. What I want to know, however, is why she is totally fine. Almost immediately, everyone turned to look at Priscilla, who looked around in confusion. Are you implying that she shouldn't be fine? Directly staring at her, Prince Valing's voice lowered. Ran looked at him unamused. Her eyes extremely narrow. Don't pretend like you didn't understand my words. She cast her gaze in all directions. To be more specific, toward the vacant seats behind a few of the princes. Something happened last night while we were having our meeting, and out of everyone present, your successor is the only one that is completely unharmed. Her normally soft tone suddenly took on an iciness as she turned her head. Is that a coincidence? Are you implying that I'm the one responsible for all of this? The smile that had been plastered across Prince Valing's face vanished, and he looked around at the other demons coldly. I was with all of you for the past month. Do you really think I have the ability to go undetected by the lot of you? That's not it. Prince Sorling interjected. He was a rather lanky demon with short green hair and the head of the Pride House. We know that it's impossible for you to have done it by yourself. He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was crystal clear as everyone's focus once again shifted toward Priscilla, who shuddered at their gaze. She felt everything turn on her at that moment. What's going on? Priscilla's mind was a complete mess. It all happened so quickly that before she knew it, she had been indirectly accused of killing 4 dukes and severely injuring 2 others. How had everything turned out this way? She had no recollection of this ever happening. She was being set up. So you're saying that Priscilla is the one responsible for all of this? Prince Valing looked behind him, taking a good look at her. He soon shook his head. That's impossible. I'm well aware of her capabilities. He leaned forward and carefully looked at everyone. Seeing their eyes, he knew that their accusations had some ground behind them. I'm sure you guys wouldn't be accusing her without any evidence. Get to the point. Tell me exactly what made you think she's the one behind this. It looks like you've finally caught on. Prince Arian beamed a grin. After that, he looked at Prince Devitt, who nodded in response, and then both of them turned around to look behind them where two demons stood. Prince Arian spoke. While the plan did indeed work and the culprit, was somehow able to kill 4 successors, they were unable to complete their jobs. 2 of them still managed to survive. Everyone's attention shifted toward the 2 dukes. Sadly, the only one that seemed to be in a state to move or talk was Duke Yukin, who lowered his hood to display his pale face. He was currently glaring at Priscilla. You didn't think I'd make it, did you? What? Priscilla looked all around her, utterly bewildered by the events unfolding in front of her. She had the urge to scream out that this was all a setup and that she wasn't responsible for any of it, but she knew that whatever she said, no one would listen to her and that her words would be ignored. She had no choice but to remain still and helplessly gaze upon her grandfather, who showed no sign of being shaken by the allegations. He turned his attention squarely on Yukin, who was staring at Priscilla with a look that was filled with killing intent. He didn't seem to be acting. Opening his mouth, Prince Valing asked, "What makes you sure that she's the one who did it? Did you see her do it?" As soon as he started speaking, a wisp of his power erupted, and it exerted pressure on the Duke, whose face became even paler. Even so, he kept glaring at Priscilla. "As he's the one who did it. I still remember the one who did this to me. He was working with her back during the time we were in the cave. His power belonged to the House of Sloth." Oh. Prince Valing's brow raised. "So you're saying that the one who did it wasn't Priscilla, but another person?" "Why yes, but I don't think you need to elaborate any further." Prince Valing cut and shifted his attention toward the others. "You've heard him, haven't you? Priscilla clearly was not the one who did this. Until you catch the one that is actually responsible for killing your successors, this is merely speculation on his end." "I knew you'd say this." Prince Arian smiled. He then looked behind him toward his successor. The smile on his face grew with amusement. "Did you forget that he's not the only one that survived?" Chapter 7:15 Culprit. "You see, for once I agree with you. It's just that." Prince Arian paused with his arms crossed and a thoughtful look. With a sideways look, he gazed at his successor, Duke Velmout. Prior to the accident, this little successor of mine, Velmout, set up several backup plans in case the situation turned south. Do you know what I found out? A smile formed on his face. When he extended his hand, a tremor went through the air and soon after, letters began to form in front of him. They dyed the air a crimson color. When he extended his hand, a tremor went through the air and soon after, letters began to form in front of him. They dyed the air a crimson color. Patriarch, if you observe this message, it indicates that something has occurred. The most likely perpetrator is Duchess Priscilla of the Sloth clan. I'm en route to meet her at the moment. The hall immediately turned silent, and Prince Arian looked behind him, toward Duke Velmout. I was a bit surprised when I saw this message, but I was even more surprised when I saw that he was still alive. For some miraculous reason he managed to survive. Just by a hairbreadth though. He licked his lips. A brief talk with him, and I was able to confirm that he had indeed been attacked by the little Duchess. This time he didn't say it was a cloaked figure, but her. Her alone. He turned his gaze to look at Priscilla. The smile on his face seemed somewhat uncomfortable to her, and she felt her heart drop. I. Her lips moved, but she was unable to utter a single sound even as her mouth parted open. What's happening? Why is this happening? I didn't do anything. No matter how much she wanted to argue under such evidence, she knew that her situation was extremely grim. That wasn't all. If that's not enough evidence for you, Prince Valing, I've got more information for you. Princess Ran started. A body suddenly materialized in front of her as she waved her hand. It belonged to a male whose features were extremely pristine and somewhat feminine. The only issue was that he was completely lifeless, with not even a trace of breath left in his body. After gazing at him for a brief period of time, the princess extended her hand and pierced his body directly in the abdominal region, subsequently extracting a small orb from the wound. "Take a look at his core." She held out her hand to show the core. It was comparable in size to a marble. "You all already know what's wrong with this, don't you?" The princess's eyes traveled around the room, taking in each and every person there. Her expression didn't shift much as she pinched the marble in her hand. At first glance, it appeared from the lack of emotion on her face as she fiddled with the core that she did not care very much that her successor had died. Despite this, everyone could sense that she was harboring deep-seated resentment. She was just very good at hiding it. Abyssal mammoth bile. Only with such means can you perfectly mask the death of someone. She drew out each word in a slow and concise manner. While fiddling with the core she was holding in her hand, she looked around at the other players and asked, "Was it the same for you?" "Yes. Yes. Yes." Her inquiry was met with a number of affirmative responses, after which the princess pulled out a flyer. Mass event quest. Quest assigner. Duchess Pertinal. Reward. The reward will depend on the contribution, with at least 5 more guaranteed for each participant. Minimum requirement. Marquee rank. Description. Request to aid Duchess Pertinal in taming the Abyssal Mammoth, a Duke-ranked monster. The minimum rank required to participate is Marquee, and the quest takes place on the 300th planetary revolution. The task entails assisting Duchess Pertinal in bringing down and taming the Abyssal Mammoth, whose approximate strength is close to that of a prince. The rewards will be determined by the contributions made throughout the quest. If the Duchess is pleased with the performance, several jor could be rewarded. What a strange coincidence, no? The princess's gaze was now fully directed toward Priscilla, who trembled at the sight of the flyer. "It's over." Indeed, the moment she took out the flyer, everyone looked at her with a convinced look. If the previous evidence wasn't sufficient to prove she was the one responsible, then this new evidence was more than enough to make that case. "Very bold of you, Valing. I didn't know you were the type to scheme like this." Prince Atten hurled, looking at Villian with an appalled expression. Next to him, Prince Sorling clenched his fist. "I'm sure you're well aware of the consequences that are going to befall you in a short moment, right?" Prince Valing. Confronted with such words, the prince's expression did not change. He looked to be completely unfazed, as if he was unaware of the circumstances in which he found himself. After turning around, he gazed directly at Priscilla, who returned his gaze with a look of her own. Opening his mouth, his calm voice traveled through the ears of everyone present. "Did you do it?" When he spoke to the Duchess, there was not the slightest indication of irritation or anger in his tone. It appeared as though he was asking her a simple and trivial question. The manner in which he carried himself made everyone frown, but nobody said a word about it. They were interested in knowing in great detail what it was that he intended to do. If not for the fact that they knew his personality well, they would have already attacked him. Was this his last desperate attempt at trying to salvage the situation? And no. A crisp stutter. Priscilla shook her head and denied the accusation while she looked at her grandfather. Gazing at his red eyes that seemed to be as calm as a well, she couldn't tell exactly what he was thinking, but she could only hope he would help her. He was her only hope. Her only hope at getting out of this situation. After maintaining eye contact with her for a few more seconds, he turned his head around to face the opposite direction. She only caught a fleeting glimpse of it, but Priscilla thought she saw a smile on his face. She wasn't certain about it, but his subsequent words caused her to exhale a sigh of relief. There. It looks like she wasn't the culprit. He had not abandoned her when he spoke to the Duchess. There was not the slightest indication of irritation or anger in his tone. It appeared as though he was asking her a simple and trivial question. The manner in which he carried himself made everyone frown, but nobody said a word about it. They were interested in knowing in great detail what it was that he intended to do. If not for the fact that they knew his personality well, they would have already attacked him. Was this his last desperate attempt at trying to salvage the situation? And no. A crisp stutter. Priscilla shook her head and denied the accusation while she looked at her grandfather. Gazing at his red eyes that seemed to be as calm as a well, she couldn't tell exactly what he was thinking, but she could only hope he would help her. He was her only hope. Her only hope at getting out of this situation. After maintaining eye contact with her for a few more seconds, he turned his head around to face the opposite direction. She only caught a fleeting glimpse of it, but Priscilla thought she saw a smile on his face. She wasn't certain about it, but his subsequent words caused her to exhale a sigh of relief. There. It looks like she wasn't the culprit. He had not abandoned her. It seems like you've become delusional. Are you trying to protect her, or is this part of your scheme? As the princess's demeanor shifted, the room's atmosphere underwent a radical transformation. Her previously expressionless face had completely changed and her gaze turned fierce. She was now at the point where she was finally beginning to show her anger. You should be well aware of what will happen now, right? And what is that? Are you pretending that you don't know? Or are you just trying to delay the inevitable? No, not at all. Prince Valing shook his head, showing no sign of being bothered in the least by the words that were being hurled in his direction. The utter calmness and confidence in his voice somewhat managed to calm the princess, who snorted and sat back down. It was already a miracle that none of the other elders had exploded into a rage as a result of what had occurred, but despite their lack of action, it was clear that they were experiencing feelings that went beyond those of the princess. They were probably doing their best to hold themselves back. They were saving it for when the time came for them to finally make a move. If there was something that everyone was aware of, it was that no matter what transpired during this meeting, by the time it was over, there would be only 6 houses left standing. They had time to spare. Isn't it weird? Prince Valing suddenly asked, his collected tone reverberating through the entire space. Staring at him, none of the other demons showed much of a reaction. Well, none aside from Prince Arian, whose face carried a hint of a smile. His thoughts were hard to read. It had always been like this. What's weird, if I may ask? Valing spared him a glance before answering. Everything. Everything about the situation is weird. Is this really the best you can come up with to save yourself? Prince Sorling spat. Unlike the others, he wasn't as patient. He was growing increasingly irritated, and he soon began to speak more loudly. A thin layer of darkness began to form around his body at the same time, spreading across the area around him. I've had enough of your bullshit. Either come clean or I'll personally make you. Calm down. Prince Valing didn't seem disturbed in spite of the clear threat. Rather, he grew even calmer. Surveying the area around him, he looked at everyone present in the room before asking. I'll ask again. Don't you all think that the situation is too perfect? He continued before anyone else could speak. From the bile to the messages to the fact that she is the only one unharmed. Isn't it a bit too obvious? He looked toward Priscilla. I've known her for quite a long time and I've personally taught her. If we were to really plan all of this, we wouldn't make such obvious mistakes. It's so intricately set up to point toward us that it just feels unnatural. Is this really your argument? Prince Sorling looked at him with a distorted look. He slapped the table and glared. That's the flimsiest of excuses. Own up to your actions. You weren't careless, you were just fucking stupid. As he looked around, his face turned bright red with anger. Look around you. Do you really think any one of us will be? But I do. A hushed voice interrupted Sorling at that precise moment. When he turned his head, he was taken aback to see Prince Aaron grinning and staring at Valing. His next word causes the entire room to turn quiet. Not only do I believe him, but I also think that he's not the culprit. Chapter 716 Culprit 3. The words spoken by Prince Arian brought about complete and utter silence in the room. It was so quiet that one might have been able to hear a pin drop. The focus of everyone's attention quickly shifted to him, and all he did was smile in response to it. He had long anticipated that his words would elicit such a reaction. And he was all for it. Is this some sort of joke to you? Prince Atten raised his voice and looked intently at Arian. It was common knowledge that Arian took pleasure in pulling such stunts. It wouldn't come as a surprise to find out that he may have been pulling one of his typical pranks at the moment. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to be the case this time. Rather than looking at them, Prince Arian looked behind him where Valmont stood. Although he was barely holding on, he was still conscious. This was enough for Prince Arian, who started speaking. I found something rather interesting last night while I was trying to save him. As the Duke extended his hand toward him, his body shot in his direction, only stopping when it was a few centimeters away from him. Turning his head, Arian looked at the others with a hint of a smile in his eyes. It almost slipped past me. Had it not been for my strength, I would have probably missed it, but... Suddenly, a dark glow materialized on the prince's hand and encased Velmout like a cocoon. At the same time, the duke's limbs shot up and straightened out in an unnatural manner. Fuck. Velmout let out a series of groans that could only be described as wretched and agonized, but the prince paid them no attention and continued with whatever it was he was doing. The procedure was completed in a little under 2 minutes. When Prince Arian withdrew his hand, the duke helplessly fell to the ground. Unconcerned, he extended his hand to the others, revealing a thin silver thread. "What's this? What in the world?" Immediately, everyone's pupils shrank. Seeing their reactions, Arian smiled in delight. He had been waiting for this moment ever since the start of the meeting. The only reason he hadn't revealed it to them from the very beginning was because he wanted to see their reactions, and seeing exactly how they were reacting, he knew that it was all worth it. "I'm sure all of you understand what this means, right?" Bringing the thread forth, he casually threw it on the table before looking down at Duke Velmout. While he had lost consciousness, his core was still intact. He'd just need a couple of days to fully recover. His situation wasn't serious. It was only through sheer good fortune that he was able to find it. He happened upon the thread completely by accident. It was during the time that he was tending to Velmout's wounds. Without his prince-level strength, discovering the thread would have been nearly impossible. It was so small and well-concealed that it might have escaped his notice if it had not been situated near one of his major veins. One could say that his luck was rather good. When he looked at Velmout again, any trace of a smile that had previously been on his face vanished completely. The thread was an obvious giveaway of what had happened. Someone tried to tamper with his memories. Such skill, while uncommon, wasn't unheard of. This thread that contained faint demonic fluctuations was the best evidence of it. Someone tampered with his memories. A voice abruptly spoke, sharing the same thought as Prince Arian, who turned to face the speaker. It was none other than Prince Valing, who appeared as composed as he'd been previously. It was his calmness that bothered Prince Arian, but he decided to let it go for now as he nodded his head in agreement. "You're right. It's very likely that someone has tampered with his memories. Such power is extremely rare, but once the source is removed, one can easily identify it as such." With a nod of the head, his focus shifted to Duke Yukin and Priscilla. Before continuing, he interlaced his hands and drummed his fingers over his interlocked hands. "He probably isn't the only one that's been affected." Following his words, all but Prince Devitt turned to face Priscilla. Even Prince Valing turned around to face her. Feeling countless gazes fall toward her, Priscilla almost felt her breath stop. Thankfully, in contrast to before, their gazes were not menacing, and this was the reason why she was able to maintain some semblance of composure. Looking around her, she looked at her grandfather. Staring at each other for a couple of seconds, he extended his hand in her direction. "Don't move. Wait." Before her grandfather's hand reached her, a voice interjected. It belonged to none other than the princess, who stood up and walked up to her. She looked at Valing. "Let me do the test. We can't have you manipulate the results. Go ahead." As cool and collected as ever, he took his hand back and sat still in his chair. Princess Ran didn't want to make things too difficult for him, and so she immediately turned her head to face Priscilla, who stared back at her. "Relax your mind." She did not put up any resistance, and a force ended up enveloping her entire body. The force penetrated deep into her body, and all of a sudden, her body straightened itself out as she slowly felt herself being lifted into the air. HMH. It was painful, but she was somewhat able to suppress her groan. It felt as though countless needles had punctured her body and traveled through her veins. It was extremely uncomfortable. Thankfully, the process lasted no longer than a couple of seconds, and it wasn't long before she felt the princess let go of her. Immediately after she recovered, she noticed that the entire room was quiet. When she looked up, she saw that everyone's attention was concentrated on the thin thread that was floating above the princess's palm. She fiddled with it for a few seconds before tossing it to Prince Valing, who caught it and then turned her attention to Prince Arian. "It looks like your guesses weren't wrong." Prince Valing's expression didn't change much, but Priscilla could tell from the way he was reacting to the unexpected information that he was taken aback in some way. It was clear that he had not planned for such an occurrence. Prince Arian crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, musing to himself. Not until some time later did he look at Prince Devitt. There was no trace of a smile in his eyes as he gazed at him. Understanding the meaning of his gaze, Prince Devitt turned around to look at Duke Yukon. "Let me." Prince Aten offered himself up. Standing up, he walked toward the Duke and carried out a similar procedure. It didn't take long before a glow appeared all around the Duke's body, and shortly after that his body began to fall to the ground. The expression on Prince Aten's face did not change as he withdrew his hand from Duke. However, when he extended his hand again, subtle changes appeared as nothing appeared on it. This was enough for everyone to understand something. Prince Devitt and Duke Yukon found themselves the center of everyone's attention all of a sudden, as Priscilla and Prince Valian now found themselves thrust into the background. Their expressions were anything but friendly. Surely this isn't a coincidence, right? Prince Sorling's gaze was fixed intently in the direction of Prince Devitt as he posed the question. Prince Devitt remained silent as he calmly absorbed their gazes. With the hood covering his face, no one could discern his expression. In light of the upcoming world decree, I'm not surprised that something like this happened. It all makes sense now that I think about it. Prince Arian did the honor of speaking, his voice finding hints of amusement once more. He looked toward Prince Devitt. Having won the previous 3 world decrees, you are well aware that this world decree will be detrimental to you if we join forces to stop you. Since you don't want that to happen, you've devised a plan to eliminate all the successors and blame the House of Sloth in the process. Killing a successor is the same as creating internal problems, as infighting will start in order to determine the next successor. Typically, succession takes a lot of years to nurture, and during that time you'd be the only winner. While Yukon is indeed injured, unlike Velmout behind me, his injuries seem a lot lighter. That couldn't be a coincidence, right? Prince Arian smiled. The more I consider it, the more I realize that you are the greatest winner among us all. With the House of Sloth eliminated, the House of Envy would indeed be the biggest winner. A succession war usually took place over the course of many years and cut down on a lot of resources and personnel in the process. By the time the next world decree occurred, everyone's forces would have been drastically reduced, except for Prince Devitt's. How ruthless. Prince Arian couldn't help but comment as the smile on his face dissipated. You're truly unlucky. If I hadn't discovered the thread, then your plan would have actually been successful. You left Velmout alive in order to obtain an alibi in order to shift the blame to the Duchess. Prince Arian's eyes narrowed. From the gallbladder to her being unharmed while the others were, to the letters. The plan was slowly starting to unravel before his eyes. Duke Yukon purposely instigated the Duchess into a conflict with him. The purpose behind it was to anger her and give reason to the others to believe that she'd want to form a partnership with them. Then once the others took the bait, he'd kill them off individually while also using the gallbladder to hide how they died. Of course, hiding wasn't the only intent. And, no. Duke Yukon spoke up all of a sudden. He was still recovering from the sudden intervention, but he managed to utter a few words. It's a scheme. I'm innocent. No one paid any attention to him. His words were meaningless to them. Prince Arian's words continued. In the process, he purposely left Velmout alive just barely before altering his memories so that he could make for the perfect alibi. When all is said and done, he also injured himself, which in turn would make things more suspicious towards the Duchess's side. His eyes narrowed as they shifted toward Priscilla. The flaw in all of this came down to the fact that, as Prince Valing suggested, everything was too flawless. It was too perfect. Even without my findings, I would have probably assumed that something was framing the Duchess. The hall turned quiet. Thereafter they all turned to look at Prince Devitt. Do you have anything to say?